minutes?
Yep, there's a packet.
They went in today? Good.
Sorry, I was water pitcher and
Okay.
And the minutes look quite satisfactory to me, and I would move to approve.
It's been
I'll
moved,
make a second.
moved by Peckham, seconded by Kemp North. Any discussion? If not, all those in favor of approval of the minutes will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? No? That motion carries. Let me explain why we're here tonight, because this is not a meeting that we had planned on having, but we had two presentations to the officers in the department, the police department, and we received some feedback from them specific to the issues of our tasks and whether or not we had adequately addressed them. And they were particularly concerned about the issue of systemic racism. And while we didn't make any findings that there was systemic racism, we've had a request loud and clear that we should address it and say that if we didn't find it, we should perhaps opine on that issue. Mike? And then the second issue, as you roll things out, you think you know what you mean with different things. Was there were a lot of questions about the ethics board and how we were going to treat the issue of discipline at a state level relative to our recommendation. And we thought it might be worthwhile for us just to go back and revisit the various charges or tasks that and responsibilities that we had as a task force in the original resolution, and make sure that we can address it. I was asked to address these issues with the department, and I said I cannot speak for the task force without taking the issue to the task force and getting you all to weigh in. And I think that our silence on the issue was indicative of the fact that we didn't find anything, but I think we want to make sure that we can answer that question when we go to the community. So, Mike?
So going back to, kind of where this stemmed from in the George Floyd incident, it was a proactive approach to start examining things that we knew would be part of the public discourse and get our hands around where we were as a community. And as I've said, before, that, when you're measured, you're revealed. And all throughout the process, the Wausau Police Department has really shined. And when you talk about the issue of systemic racism, and when we talked about it early on as it relates to the President's task force and the discussions around that issue, it was very clear that, unfortunately, in a lot of instances, law enforcement is the tip of the spear in the broader criminal justice system, that there are, number of issues that need to be addressed relative to how racism and systemic racism shows up in the criminal justice system. And it was unfortunate that officers are the front line in the face of that. And so we did spend a little bit of time discussing that. But when an issue of systemic racism exists, you have to examine the practices, policies, and culture of the organization or the community or whatever it is you're examining. And in this case, as we've examined the Wausau Police Department in terms of their policy, practices, and culture, that it just didn't simply show up. It didn't show up. I mean, there were maybe some, nuances in data in terms of, some populations having a higher interaction with law enforcement relative to populations, but was it as a result of the current culture, policies, or practices? In my opinion, the answer is no. And I think as a policing organization, what has always impressed me throughout this process is the proactive nature of this department to keep these issues at the forefront and to work with the community and to be a community-oriented policing organization. And I just simply didn't see much more need to examine that issue in a local view. Now, that doesn't mean that there aren't issues in a broader view. There certainly are. But as our charge in this department, I just did not feel like it warranted more analysis outside of what I was getting from the process. So,
I think, and we've got some representatives from the department in the audience, but I think in listening to them, I think their opinion is that our silence doesn't address the issue, and they would, in light of the fact that we have looked at it, can we address the issue and make a statement? I think that I understand their perspective, given the fact that they're under that microscope each and every day. And I think it was before we rolled this out to the public through the Public Safety Committee and others that I think it was important for us to bring us back and have that discussion as a group. Mayor?
I mean, I can wait. I see Will is ready to, I guess I wanted to suggest a way in which we incorporate it, but I don't want to interrupt. I'd like to hear more.
I'll say I do agree largely with Michael, but I think one of the things that came out of this, and one of the reasons I think as well why it was important to do this, is because even though we didn't find anything in terms of our police department, that wasn't the perception, right? In terms of what we saw from the surveys, and we found out people get their information from all different types of news medias. So it was important to provide information and education about what the police department actually does and the policies that they have, so that the public felt that their safety was ensured, that there was fairness there, that the police officers were of high caliber and character. And so I think that information educational aspect, I know that there were different things out there that the police department does do to reach out to people, but obviously that there was a need for more of that. So I think if anything, that piece was important and came out through this task force as well. And I think it just showed really well in terms of the police department, the more information that was available to the public. So I hope that the public feels better about what is in place in terms of those policies and how the police department is performing their jobs every day for our community. Thank you.
Mayor?
Yeah, so I'm glad we're having this discussion, obviously. I think it's important for our community to know. And I think, we have that page in the report where it talks about our findings. And I think probably maybe we deserve to put a page in there that says what we didn't find. And that's how I would suggest talking about this. Systemic racism, found no evidence of systemic racism. We went over the use of force policies. We didn't find anything wrong with those. And then that third item that just flew out of my brain as I was standing here talking, but also include that. Thank you.
I think this is Mike from the virtual world. I am agreeing with all the voices I'm hearing. And I think we are dealing with, in my opinion, right, when we talk about systemic racism, it's hard to identify the actors and the agencies within the criminal justice system that are contributing to that. You have a system that involves municipality, county, and state. And so we have been charged to look on the micro level, at the Wausau Police Department. But yet, we're dealing with a system that crosses other professionals, other policies, other oversight, other laws and things that we didn't touch. We heard from the county level, but when you look at our system, the criminal justice system in general, it crosses a whole bunch of not only jurisdictional, but governing boards, decision makers, trainings. And so I think to highlight that we were looking at a microcosm of a bigger system. And we have officers who are put in situations that there have laws that are passed on the state level, or they have trainings and things that are state approved, but it might not be respectful of our local culture.
Other Thoughts, comments, questions?
And I'll add just one other thing. I think it's also important just to note for anyone that's watching, this is only a study about the Wausau Police Department. So we are not saying in terms of all other departments or any other departments out there within the county, within the state, or anywhere else. Just in terms of, as Mike said, what we looked at with the Wausau Police Department, and what, obviously we didn't find here. But that's not to dismiss people's feelings or what may be going on other places. Thank you.
John, I have a question.
Go ahead, Pat.
Yeah, on the, just wondering if you could tell us if there was something in the report as it was printed that prompted the reaction that you got considering the systemic racism, and I'm just looking at the listing of the tasks and objectives that's in our packet, and about 2/3 of the way down, it says participate in community engagement activities and dialogues about policing, human service needs, and systemic racism. Was the way that was stated, was that what brought on the reaction? Because it almost reads like we have acknowledged that systemic racism exists within our system.
There are two items that drove, I think, the comments, and the chief wants to speak, but the first one was the fourth task or objective is to examine systemic racism and weigh the impact on service delivery, including policing in the city of Wausau. And then the second one was, Pat, the point that you pointed out in the community engagement activities around that issue. So, Chief, did you have a comment?
Yeah, thanks. If that's all right, I've got a number of comments. And so to answer Mr. Peckham's question, I think this task force was created as a result of community discussion and dialogue after the George Floyd incident in Minneapolis. And the task force duties and responsibilities, number 3 and number 7, both indicate that this task force's duties and responsibilities are to examine systemic racism within the Wausau Police Department. And then additionally, in the goals and tasks, systemic racism is identified as a goal and task. And so because of this stemming from the incident over in Minneapolis that led to riots across the world, including the march here in Wausau, and then the direction for this task force to evaluate systemic racism, that left, I would say, maybe I'm saying it lightly, but a sour taste in the members of the Wausau Police Department, because we're under extreme scrutiny for the last 18 months by this task force as a result of an incident that happened 3 hours away by one police officer in one incident. And so the fact that we're under scrutiny as a result of that, and then there is silence in the final report from the task force on systemic racism, that doesn't sit well with the police department or with me, is what I would say. And so I think that Mr. Loy is right in terms of the review of our policies, our practices, and our culture of the Wausau Police Department didn't indicate any evidence of systemic racism, but I would go even further as to say you hired a professional organization, the Wisconsin Institute for Public Policy and Service, to do listening sessions, to do a community survey, to do focus groups. And even within all of that, I would say the community feedback there was no evidence of systemic racism. I would say there was very few even allegations of racism within our police department. So not only from internal practices and policies, but even in terms of how our community responded to those surveys and to those focus groups and listening sessions, there was no evidence of systemic racism. So I think those are really important points to make. I think in addition to that, there was a lot of things I think that the task force considered within our police department. You heard about how we respond to mental health. You heard about how we, engage our partners throughout the community. You heard about, how we respond to racist incidents within our community, and we investigate those with great enthusiasm, because that's something that we won't stand for in our community. So, we talked about our citizen complaint process. We talked about our accreditation, the fact that we're an accredited law enforcement agency. 8% of law enforcement agencies across the country have achieved accreditation status, and I think that speaks very highly of our police department. So I think it's just really important for the task force to make a strong statement about the Wausau Police Department, and the fact that you spent 18 months doing this research and going through these efforts, and that you didn't find any evidence of systemic racism. I think that's very important. And I would say, in addition to that, just in defense of my profession and colleagues across the country who I know, this is a noble profession. I stand proud as a police officer, wearing a badge to work every single day. We aren't perfect, but we are really, really good as a profession across this country, and I'm proud of that. So I think that's important to say too.
Could I just chime in?
Go ahead, Pat.
I'm just wondering if, I don't think we can go back and change our original objectives, but I think it would be good to, if we made it clear that we saw as one of our tasks to look for evidence of systemic racism and address those if we found them. And then maybe, immediately afterwards say we didn't find them, but we hope that in the future a vigilant eye is kept open to, in case there is any finding of systemic racism in the system. But I think it'd be good to say that we didn't go into this thinking that it was present and a big problem, but we felt, that our mission was to look for it and deal with it if we found it.
Hey, I'm really sorry, you guys. Maybe I missed this in the beginning, but are we discussing what we are going to put in the report, or is there concern about what we already have put in the report?
Kaylee, the reason for the meeting tonight is that we've gone out and done now 3 presentations. One to the Police and Fire Commission, and 2, we met with the 2 different groups at the Wausau Police Department. And the feedback that we received when we met with the officers in the department was that you were charged with your 4th task and objective was to examine systemic racism and see whether it's present, and then the 8th was to engage the public and have public engagement around that issue. And our silence was concerning to the officers, and so we also had concerns expressed over one of the recommendations relative to the ethics board on the state level. So before we took this to the full council, I had statements similar to what Michael and Will had made, and we shared those observations with the department, that we didn't find it, therefore we didn't address it. But I think that they were looking for a clear statement from this body as to our action. And I didn't feel comfortable as chair of the task force speaking for the 7 members of it, and that's why we're here tonight. We thought that it was also a good opportunity to just go through our tasks and objectives to make sure that everybody's comfortable that we have indeed met them, and to clarify some of those recommendations before we take it out again to the city council in form of committees and council itself, and to the public for the public hearing. So that's why we're here tonight.
Okay, that makes a lot more sense. Thank you. Sorry.
So, John.
Michael?
So the 4th bullet in our task says for us to examine systemic racism and weigh its impact on service delivery, including policing in the city of Wausau. There is no doubt that systemic racism has an impact on this department and all departments across the country. I mean, it is something that obviously has been, the chief just said, they've had to deal with, not only in our inquiry, but just in policing and the profession in general. So it does weigh on the profession, whether, that's due, in fairness at all, to this Wausau Police Department. And I hold the Wausau Police Department in the highest regard in the state of Wisconsin. And I would be completely comfortable with adding to our report and being unequivocal in our statement saying that in our inquiry, we did not find evidence of systemic racism in the Wausau Police Department in its policies, practices, and culture, and further, and make no recommendation and change to either of those three elements as it relates to systemic racism as part of our inquiry. I would be happy to add that as a unequivocal statement from my own experience through this and supplement the report, because that is truly where I felt I landed.
So could you
Put it in a
repeat
motion?
the three? Yes, yeah.
I move that we would add to the conclusions of our report that in our inquiry as a task force, we found no evidence of systemic racism in the policies, practices, and culture of the Wausau Police Department, and make no further recommendation for the department. I'm going to add, end the survey from the community, and make no further recommendation relative to changes to policy, practices, or culture.
Is there a second?
I would second that.
Okay, we have a motion by Loy and second by Peckham. Is there any discussion on that?
Yeah, the only, I agree with that statement. The only thing I'm kind of swirling in my mind is whether or not we do want to add something to say that we recommend or that we encourage they continue to be proactive in avoiding issues or some related to systemic racism.
So,
Is that an amendment?
Yes, I guess. And see how
So there's an
people feel about it.
amendment to add on to the resolution, and we'll capture that through the recording. That encourage, was it
Do
in,
you think it
or
would be
to?
better that we say that we encourage or that we recommend that they continue to be proactive?
And recommend the department continue to be proactive in dealing with this issue.
Yes.
That is your,
Yes, that,
is there a second to the amendment?
I'll second that.
So one is that the motion is reflective and the amendment is future orientated. Any discussion on the amendment? Any discussion on the amendment? If not, all is in favor of adoption of the amendment.
I,
Opposed, no? That motion carries. Any discussion on the motion as amended?
I appreciate the motion and the amendment. I am struggling with that we are using the phrase systematic racism, and we're not identifying that academically, the American Bar Association, systematic racism in the criminal justice system is not just law enforcement. It's not just the Wausau Police Department. And so if we need to give, I feel we need to give an idea of that we're looking at one part of an individual's experience with a system. And so we're looking at the front line. We're looking at everybody sees them, everybody, they're the ones that get the negative media, the negative, whatever, around an issue that starts before people even have an interaction with the system. and to identify and to highlight what truly, when we talk about systematic racism in the criminal justice system, we're talking about stuff that we, the police department, the community has no control over. And so I'm really struggling with not highlighting that our role was to look at one small piece of the bigger system.
I think the motion does say, though, that we didn't find it in the Wausau Police Department. He was specific about that, which I appreciated.
I'm
But I
with
think-
Mike. I agree with what he's saying because, to be honest, I just know this community, and I don't really think that people are going to take the time to make the distinguishment between the department and everything else. I mean, people are going to look at that and be like, well, no racism, awesome, and that's going to be the end of it. And I just don't think that's accurate. So I have to agree with what Mike was saying.
And I think I agree with both Kaylee and Mike. I think to add to that, I think in the beginning, because now we have sort of reflective of what we're doing now, sort of future, I think it would be important to acknowledge sort of the issue in terms of the past as well, and saying that although we do acknowledge that in our society and within other, throughout our country, systemic racism, whether within our criminal justice does exist, in terms of our study in regards to, and then go into what Michael said, and then add on the last piece. But some acknowledgement, I think, of the issue in and of itself, and then obviously making that distinguishment about what our task was, as Michael put it, and then reflective in terms of moving forward into the future in terms of how we recommend that they continue to be proactive.
Mayor?
Yeah, I think it's worth mentioning that, we made a lot of recommendations when we talked about the dependencies, and we talked about how we do rely on these other parts of the system. Why wouldn't we add this in there too? I mean, we're obviously leaders in this. Let's continue to be. Let's push on them.
Chief?
Frankly, I don't know why you need to add any caveats about the rest of the system. Your role as a task force was to review the Wausau Police Department and systemic racism as it pertains to the police department, not to review and go into the entire criminal justice system. You guys didn't do any research into the systemic racism as it pertains to the justice system as a whole, to Marathon County court system or anything like that. Your role was to focus on the police department in the city of Wausau, and I think a simple statement that is very strong in regards to the fact that systemic racism does not exist within the Wausau Police Department is sufficient. I don't know why the task force would need to go any further than that. That's my frank opinion.
Just an observation. I agree with you in part, but we did look beyond just the police department and the fact that we invited the DA's office in, and we had Chad Billup and representatives from the county jail system in. So we did begin to look at the issue of the system, but I'm more inclined to agree with you in principle that we didn't look at society. And our charge was not to look at society. Our charge was to look at how this impacts the city and the city police department. And I do get a little bit concerned when we start trying to bring in, we're here and we were created because of concerns over systemic racism. The body by its nature. I think what we're trying to do is focus in now on where are we going directionally. I think one of the concerns that we had was that there was a lack of data in some cases, and one of our recommendations deals with trying to gather the data into the future. But I think Michael summarized it well. We spent a lot of time looking at officer-involved shootings, the use of force, the policies and procedures, the hiring and training procedures, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And we didn't find racism, systemic racism in those discussions. So I think what we're trying to do is to deal with the issue that we were tasked with, and we, as much as we'd like to be all-encompassing, I don't know that we can be.
One last thought on that. Turn myself off. So the reason that part of the reason why we started this whole thing was not just what was going on in the city of Wausau, but how everything else impacted. The reason the officers sometimes were unfairly characterized was because of what was happening in other places. So to acknowledge that, because that is part of, that does impact the officers here, what's going on in other places, why there has been such scrutiny on them. But then to take that further, as we were saying, to say it, though that happens, though that has happened these other places, and this is partly the reason why we got here, because what happens outside, we're not in the bubble, what happens outside of the city of Wausau also had an impact in our survey on how people looked at some of our officers unfairly in a lot of cases, but it was that outside, and so we're acknowledging, I think, that this has occurred, but in looking at our own force, that we're saying here, in terms of what we found, we did not find this case here, though not dismissing that it happened other places, and that's the reason why we did this study, so that we could see whether or not that there were gaps here, and to acknowledge our community's concerns. So that's part of the reason why I think it'd be important to sort of just add that small piece. But I see in principle as well and keeping things simple, but I just wonder in terms of the community, when they look at that, it's important enough to mention it, and it is important enough to make that strong statement when it comes to the Wausau Police Department. But I think it's also important to acknowledge sort of the elephant in the room and how we got to this place. Just my take.
I think the initial document that was created and approved by the city council acknowledges all of that. I think, for the last 18 months, yes, we heard from, the chief deputy at the sheriff's department, we heard from the district attorney's office, but, the survey document, the focus groups, the listening sessions, all of that work was very narrowly focused on the men and women of the Wausau Police Department. It was very narrow. We provided you data, demographic data on our traffic stops, on our citations issued. We provided you demographic data on our arrests. We provided you demographic data on our use of force all of the things that you looked at, it was very narrowly focused on the police department in the city of Wausau. And I think it's important. In fact, I think as a result of this 18-month process that this task force underwent, I think you owe it to the police department in the city of Wausau to make a simple, strong statement without any caveats, without having to acknowledge anything else that's going outside the borders of the city of Wausau. We have, as some have said, we have shined through this process, and we have great pride in ourselves and in our work, and I think our community does too. Our community had an 86% positivity rate towards our work. There's 86% of the citizens of Wausau that were surveyed said we do an excellent or a very good job. And so I think it's important to acknowledge that. I think our staff deserve that.
All right, I'm going to, where are we? We have a motion and a second, and we have concerns that were expressed. So we have a motion before us that was amended. What are your wishes? Are there any other discussion? Any other discussion? Any other discussion? If not, we are voting on the motion as amended at this time. All those in favor of that motion will signify by saying aye.
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 Opposed, no? That motion carries. So I think what I'm hearing is that there's a desire for us to set the stage, and I think in our presentations, and you've not been party or privy to, the mayor does in her comments when we've gone out address that issue specifically of how did we get here, and so it has been covered in all of our discussions to date, and I would imagine will be covered in our discussions going forward. So I think, Will, that, and Mike, that, and Kaylee, that point, we were tasked and we were charged with a duty based upon issues that had presented themselves to the community. And we have now developed a series of recommendations. So, and we will have an opportunity to revisit this when we develop our final plan, if we think it's a concern after hearing from the public and the council. So are there other questions you have in the packet, the tasks? Do you feel as if we have done everything? I know that we need to conduct the public hearing. Tentatively, the schedule going forward is to finalize a report presented to the Public Safety Committee on the 14th, or excuse me, the 18th of this month, take it to the city council, and the 26th at 6:30, and to have a public hearing on May 18th, and we were looking at 4:30. Does that, though, I don't know if you wish to be there, but I think for the public hearing, this group will probably have that hearing. Would May 18th work? The other dates are set by the council. We were looking at 4:30, but that's up in the air. Because getting people before they get home, we haven't had tremendous attendance at night. I think people go home and stay home. Thoughts?
I don't know though, aren't people, because like myself, like usually I'm scheduled to work till 4:30, and most people are just getting off work at 4:30. I mean, I don't know, but as you say, there hasn't been a whole lot of great attendance as we look out in the audience right now, but I just don't know. What would be?
Well, it's certainly open for any time, but we can do it on that date at a time to be determined. Does 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock, 6:30 work better?
I would say at least for people just getting off like myself, preferably at least 5:30 at the earliest. I think 4:30 might be tough if we're trying to get some people to get here and they're still at work or just getting off.
Should we just go with 6:30? I think that 5:30 is an awkward time for a lot of people. So should we plan for 6:30 on the 18th? We can get on the city's calendar and we'll get the notice out. And then at the other task that we have not done is we've not developed a formal plan of action. We've made the recommendations, but I think it would be in our interest to hear from the community and then ultimately at that meeting formalize how we would begin to implement those recommendations. So that would be something we would do after we receive the input from the various people. But in terms of our tasks, is everybody agreeable to that approach? Again, going to public safety on the 18th at 5:15, going to the council on April 26th at 6:30, and having a public hearing on May 18th at 6:30.
I have a question, John. And when you talk about implementation, is that going to be a discussion of, in this listing of tasks and objectives, I think it's called, there are a number of things that are going to require follow-up and monitoring. Is that what you're going to talk about, is how that's going to happen and who's going to be responsible for it?
Well, I think we're charged with developing a plan of action, which I think is those steps. Otherwise, all we've done is we've created a piece of paper and we've relied on other people to do it. So I think what was envisioned was that we would try to make perhaps some steps in the process. So if we make this recommendation, here's where we ought to do it. But I think it gets into the point of implementation. But ultimately, the decisions on policy will be made by other bodies. It'll be the city council. It'll be the North Central, or the Community Services Board for North Central Healthcare. It'll be the Marathon County. It'll be other parties that will have the control over the resources. But we need to figure out how we get these issues before them. And we started that process through the dependencies. Any thoughts? I think we can just move ahead, and when we come back, so we would be meeting probably that last week in May as a task force to wrap up. Finally, wrap up. And then try to work with groups to get the policies and recommendations implemented. Mayor?
Were you going to address the ethics board thing?
Yes,
Okay.
that was going to be the clarification of the priorities. I was just going over the duties and that. So if there's no discussion on that, we'll move on to clarification of the priorities. One of the things we've heard wherever we've gone is relative to our recommendation that we support resolution to support legislation for an ethics board for law enforcement on a statewide basis. I think in a discussion with the chief before the meeting, indicated that legislation has passed that charged and tasked the Law Enforcement Standards Board to address this issue. And both he and the mayor are members of that. And I think we weren't looking for an ethics board, but rather a board that would track disciplinary actions or resignations in lieu of discipline to make sure that we had a good database out there so that people don't make the same mistake in hiring somebody twice or in different situations. Chief?
Thank you. So in Wisconsin Act 82 that was signed into law by the governor in November, one of the things that they changed in the legislature, in the statutes, is that the Law Enforcement Standards Board should evaluate decertification of law enforcement officers. It gives Law Enforcement Standards Board the ability to create rules around decertification when people resign employment in lieu of termination or are terminated, and that's a new rule, which I think is the intent based on the discussion that the task force had probably in the last summer. So this legislation came after that discussion that the task force had about that recommendation. So I know that there's already a subcommittee of the Law Enforcement Standards Board that is discussing that specific item. And so there is already legislation in place and action being taken by LESB. So that's information for the task force. My opinion is that recommendation can be maybe just lined out because there's already legislation and action being taken, but I leave that to the will of the task force.
And I'm going to look to Michael Loy. You were one of the proponents of this, I think, early on, and I think we've got clarification.
I'd say cross it out. I mean, the job's done. That was my recollection. Was we were looking at a series of bills and we were making recommendations of whether or not we supported them or not. And at the time we supported it, the bill is now passed.
Was that really I'm just asking, was that the extent of what we were looking for? Because I think in my mind, I was looking, in terms of recommendation, in term to go a little bit further. So I guess in my mind, I kind of crafted it and looking at it like we do with lawyers in terms of if there's a violation, you go before, sort of our ethics board, and they make and it's, all throughout the state, they make the determination on whether or not that person can go back to work anywhere, not just in terms of making recommendations on how police departments in terms of should handle these ethical issues. Am I getting that mixed up, or?
I think we're saying similar things, Mr. Harris. I think that what you're describing, so Law Enforcement Standards Board They're the statutory authority on certification of police officers in the state of Wisconsin. So in order to become certified as a police officer and do the work of a police officer, you have to go through the steps that the Law Enforcement Standards Board has created for sworn law enforcement officers in the state of Wisconsin. And so then to maintain that certification, you have to, you have your continuing education requirements, qualify with your firearm, and meet all the standards that are set forth by the Law Enforcement Standards Board. And so this legislation, Act 82, gives Law Enforcement Standards Board the authority to create additional rules around decertification of law enforcement officers, which that's my recollection of what the discussion at the task force was about, was to make sure that there's accountability and we don't have what's known in the media as gypsy cops,
Right.
causing, they're unethical, they do something wrong, and this law enforcement agency, they're under investigation, and then resign, and then because they haven't gone in front of the standards board, they can go to another law enforcement agency. And that was the intention of the legislature in Wisconsin, Act 82, that was signed into law. So I think I'm agreeing with what you're saying, and I think this legislation encapsulates what you're asking for.
I just
And I guess
ask a question of you, Will, in your capacity as the chair of the Police and Fire Commission. Do you feel as if you in that capacity, and you and Michael are both on as representatives of that group on this body, do you feel as if you have the authority to review ethical issues of the law enforcement community in the city under your current powers?
No, and not under as we were talking about, like an overall impact. Like if you have one person, like you were saying, Gypsy, where one person, let's say, is in Eau Claire, and then comes and then applies to Wausau Police Department or some other department that maybe doesn't follow a system or doesn't really call and check or whatever, because they're able to just move around because instead of going before a police and fire commission, and some places actually don't have one, they just resign and then apply somewhere else. There's no accountability. I think that's more what I was getting at. And I guess the last question on the new authorities, I mean, they have the authority to, but have they yet, or is that in the works for them to then state that? Because you said it was kind of the intent, but is there something further that they've said in terms of that they're actually going to set something out with this authority in terms of doing these types of steps?
Yeah, our first meeting this year was last month, and we discussed this item and discussed the creation of a subcommittee that will bring us recommendations on how to proceed with that decertification process, because there isn't one that really exists with LESB right now. So, I mean, I can't tell you what's going to happen in the future, what that process will look like. Right. But that's the intention of LESB, is to evaluate the process. And the other thing I would say, there is additional legislation that was passed and put into law, kind of around what you're talking about, which is access to law enforcement personnel files. You know, if one of our officers applies to another law enforcement agency, and that law enforcement agency comes to me and says, "Chief, I want to see that personnel file of the officer who has applied to my agency," I am bound by statute to give them that information. And so the openness and access to law enforcement personnel files has also been increased as a result of legislation to remedy some of the issues you're describing of gypsy cops. I mean, I think Act 75 and Act 82 both have been signed into law, and both of them are around openness of personnel files and making sure that law enforcement ethics is maintained.
Okay. Thank you.
As far as our report, it would make sense to me to state that we supported this measure, and we are pleased to see that the legislature provided at least a response to it.
My only concern about that, Pat, is that we developed a recommendation after Act 82 was in law, so I don't think our efforts led to anybody doing anything differently, but we can do that if you want.
And maybe just say we supported what became state legislation. to that effect.
Or I guess I get kind of what Pat is saying, only, to the extent that this was an issue that we actually looked at and took time. So, in thinking about, the taxpayers' money and resources in terms of this study, that we did actually do that work. So I guess some acknowledgement that we did the work in terms of looking at that. But obviously, this was an ongoing effort as well that has been accomplished before, obviously, we concluded.
Why don't we put a paragraph in the findings section, is that one of the concerns we had was relative to the disciplinary and tracking of activity by police officers moving from one department to another, and that was addressed through Act 82. We could put something like that in our findings.
Sounds good to me.
Anything else relative to to our priorities? So we're moving the ethics board out because we've got that addressed through Act 82, and we'll put that in our findings section. We have addressed the issue earlier relative to our tasks. If not, the final report, I'll turn it over to the mayor and for a progress update.
Okay, well, while you were talking, I was updating as well. I don't know, I feel like you've all looked through it as we went along. I'd be happy to share it out again with you if you'd like that for the minutes. I feel good about where we're going. Is there anything, I feel like we hit everything. Do you want to see it again? Do you want me to share it?
I'd like to see it
All right, let me,
with the executive summary, if possible.
well.
Do you want it sent to you or you want it tonight?
Do you have the executive summary? An executive summary?
Not quite done.
I don't need
Pending
to see it tonight, certainly, but if we could receive it, I don't know if Mayor's gonna put some further finishing touches on it or whatever, but, yeah, it is, when the presentations were made to the Police and Fire Commission and to the officers, what were they given? Some printed material or?
It's the
Oh,
report
okay.
that I've been sharing with you all. Here, I'm gonna share it right now.
They've been given that with some, in the acknowledgement section, we particularly mentioned the support we received from the chief and Deputy Chief Barnes and other parties there. We summarized some of the key findings, and that might be one of the recommendations that I would have, is that we have under the findings page a quick summary of some of the survey results, because I think the chief mentioned those, and we'll get those questions when we go out to the public.
I'm not sure if you can, I can see my mouse here, but it doesn't look like you're seeing.
We're not.
The big gray rectangle.
No, it says. Let me just try this one more time. Let me get rid of everything else. I apparently have 45 projects open. Okay, we're gonna try this one more time. All right, I'm gonna maybe breeze through some of the stuff that you probably recall from before. Final report and recommendations, we'll change the date again. Acknowledgements, I think Mr. Robinson went through what his acknowledgement was, but I don't know. Okay. Why do we have a policing task force? You know, we want to be responsive and not reactive. We also have a vision of excellence. Continuous improvement's important to us. Background, our timeline of what got us here and why we started. I think it's important that we talk. There was a request from Police and Fire Commission, so we started. Citizen oversight, we want to make sure that folks know there already is citizen oversight as a part of this. We have the Police and Fire Commission, we have the Public Health and Safety Committee, and we have the mayor. So Police and Fire Commission, it's statutory. We have Public Health and Safety, where they discuss kind of policy recommendations and financing, and then me, day-to-day oversight. We wanted to, again, reinforce that what we're doing here is deliberative inquiry. We wanted to deep dive into the current policies and practices. We wanted to make sure that our community knows that we're doing this because we want to meet the needs and expectations and assumptions, address some of those assumptions. And we also wanted to talk about what we're missing. Here you go. We just went through the authorizing resolution, all 12 of those tasks. There you all are, your mission and purpose, providing a community-led public safety recommendations to the public. And then you might recall we started on September 21st, and you've been meeting every day since, every month since, so thank you for this. This goes through our process of what we did. We started off with listening sessions. We had a questionnaire that then went to inform our survey and focus groups. The survey was broad. We wanted to make sure that we got as many answers as we could, but then we did notice there were some folks that didn't respond to the survey. So we held special focus groups to make sure that we were hearing from everybody in our community. This is just a lineup of our listening sessions. We did a lot of them. Thank you for everyone that participated. Then we worked with WIPs to design our survey to understand the perceptions. We wanted to make sure we understood what our community concerns were. We wanted to ask about people's personal experiences with police and where they got their information. And then we got answers in 3 languages, English, Hmong, and Spanish. And these are our findings. So majority of our respondents are satisfied. We did find a contingency of folks who did express more negativity about law enforcement, and that was largely from young, non-white, non-heterosexual, non-homeowners. We discovered that there's a 50-50 split on whether the level of safety has changed in Wausau year over year, I think 2020 to 2021. Mental health and addiction resources are a top priority. We heard that over and over and over again across all any kind of status that people had. Recruiting quality candidates is critical. We agree. The community gets its information on police from all kinds of places. And the majority of respondents who had interactions with police in the past year noted that they were favorable. Here's the page where I'm offering that we find what we didn't find. I will add in the language that you just passed tonight.
Can I suggest that what we didn't find? I think the findings should
Okay.
include that.
Is that what? Okay.
I think that was our discussion, so.
Alrighty.
We just put that number 1.
Yep. All right, issues and recommendations. So the issues and recommendations we found are related to mental health and human resources, officer wellness, cultural competency, and community engagement. So that's where our recommendations came from. So you all see these, mental health and human services. CART expansion was number 1. I want to make sure that I have your in order here. Continued outreach to the homeless services with the police department, but we want a social worker. We'll continue talking about that in the next few weeks. We'd like North Central Healthcare to continue pursuing their strategies for community-based case management services. We need them as a strong local partner. We want to request that the legislature clarify and address law enforcement's role in commitments and crisis services. And we also want to make sure that we have community partnerships that are helping us with some of those mental health and human service needs that we've come across, including Metro Ride. Officer wellness and training, really important. We want to make sure that we have a specialized EAP program because being a police officer is not the same as doing other city jobs, and there's a lot more background that a mental health counselor would need before even getting started. So we want to make sure that we have the best and most qualified folks helping us out when we need it. We would like yearly cultural awareness and education and training, and we want to expand and invest in mental health training resources. And I will remove item 4. Cultural competency. We want to make sure that we have on-call interpretive services and proactively letting the public know that this is available. And then we also talked about learning basic phrases in various languages. Lastly, community engagement. We want to make sure that in the same way that we are doing our neighborhood groups with Wausau Police Department kind of leading us with those, that we do the same thing with our other communities that maybe are not represented in those neighborhood groups. So our Black community, our Hispanic community, Hmong, LGBTQ, our new refugees, and other groups that maybe we didn't mention here, but we definitely don't want to exclude anyone. We want to make sure that we're developing a communication policy that's multicultural and multimedia. We don't want to just assume we're only on social media or only on Channel 9. We want it to be across the board. We want to continue partnerships with our research organizations so we can continuously collect information on social justice issues and the criminal justice system. We want to keep an eye on this. We think it's important. Did you want to say something? Okay. We also want to make sure that we're conducting a regular periodic community survey, much like we did before, just so we can keep our finger on the pulse and make sure that we're meeting our community's expectations. And then this is where I worked on prioritizing your list of these. So we're going to go back and probably make sure, but this is our recommendation, but as prioritized. Obviously, we'll update it. Removing some of those other things. So do you want to look specific?
Number 2, I thought, was the homeless. Was it, Mike? Yes. So we need to make sure that that's reflected.
Sounds good. I'm not going to live edit here, I think. Then we have 6 through 10. Training. And then, there we go. And I'll send this out to you so that you have it for the minutes and you can review it before we take it to committee. This is dependencies. We recognize that we aren't the only rodeo in town, and we do depend on some of our local government agencies to help us with this work. So when it comes to our various recommendations, we can't do it alone. So this is the graph. We kind of went through this. We can't expand CART without support from North Central and Marathon County. We can't continue our homeless outreach without support from these other organizations. We can't request that the legislature clarify without support from everyone in Wisconsin. Officer wellness and training, same thing. Making sure that we're community engagement. And then we have further reading and links that will be linked to all of the work that we've done as a committee, questionnaire, survey, also the results and the focus group results, videos, all of the stuff you've done here will be linked, minutes, resolution, all of it, and thank you.
Any questions? Okay. It'll be subject to a few little edits, and we'll get that out, and we'll share it with the public safety. Again, those dates are the 18th for public safety, the 26th for the council, and May 18th for the hearing. And then, do we want to pick a date that last week of May at this time to meet after the hearing? Do we want to meet on the 23rd?
At what time? Same time?
6:30?
Okay.
Then we can really be done? We will send out, I'm looking at we. Gene will send out a reminder and maybe a placeholder for those dates. Just a logistical question. I know we had a time certain, and with the new council elections, I assume that Pat will continue to serve as a council rep, even though he won't be on the council, and
Yeah, I'm going to ask for special dispensation to allow him to finish up the month of May. I don't know that there'll be a problem with that, but that will be one of the things I do.
I'm perfectly willing to do that as kind of a, even as ex officio, kind of a continuing role.
okay. Any other questions relative to the final report? Any other issues before us? We've had some officers patiently sitting out there. Do you want to provide any comments? If not, again, I want to thank the task force members for their work, and we're not done yet, but we've had a lot of effort going into this, and appreciate all of your perspectives and commitment to the process. So with that, a motion to adjourn is in order.
I'll make a first motion to adjourn.
Been moved. Is there a second?
Second.
Moved and seconded to adjourn. All those in favor will signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed, no. That motion carries. I was thinking you wanted to stay all night.